Okay, one second.
Just had a LinkedIn message to tell me this.
Yep.
Hey everybody, this is Ben Atkinson at LinkedIn, and this is our interview series on inspiring leadership in challenging times. So if you're watching, please like, share, and join in with questions, and we'll give you a shout out. So with me today is, as always, my friend and leadership expert and coach, Jonathan Bowman-Perks. Who are we interviewing today?
Well, we're very lucky to have a very good friend of mine, Lieutenant General James Bashall, CBE. James is a director, a consultant and a trustee, but he had a very prestigious career in the military. And we go back to P Company together when we're doing airborne training selection. And he has had a fascinating career. James, over to you. Perhaps you could give us an update of some of the jobs you did while you were in the military, and also what life is like for you in lockdown and the kind of work you're doing today. Perhaps you could begin with that.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, Jonathan, Ben. Good to see you. And I hope we're going to work on the Wi-Fi today. So I think we're in the last few years of my military service. I mean, as with most people, I did a variety of command and staff appointments, and I was very, very lucky to command an armoured division in Germany, which was a wonderful experience. And then from there, I did a fantastic staff job in the PGHQ as the chief of staff in PGHQ, which was at a time of the close down of Afghanistan, a lot of focus on bringing people back and all the equipment we had to recover. From there, I did an interesting job for a few months on HR with as the Army's personnel director, and then I finished commanding what was ultimately called Home Command, which was a 3-star command based back in Aldershot, with a variety of HR and also homeland operations focus. So it was a great sort of final 10 years in the military of some really interesting work.
Yeah, and PGHQ, for those who weren't in the military, do you want to explain a bit about what the
Permanent Joint Headquarters? Yeah, the Permanent Joint Headquarters, which was established, I suppose, as sort of a defence strategy following the Falklands War, where there was thought to be confusion of command and control between who had actual authority over some of the assets that were deployed to the South Atlantic. And so they created a permanent joint headquarters, and the permanent meant that it was always in place, because previously it had rotated, the joint commander had rotated through the 3 services, and so this was a permanent structure.
Yeah.
And the command, the permanent joint headquarters, then took under command everyone who was deployed on overseas operations around the world.
Well, I've always admired all the different things you've gone for. You've got a zest for life. And after leaving the military, you've done this portfolio career, and it'd be interesting just to tell people the kind of stuff you're doing now. But also you did one of the legs of the round the world clipper race, which is not for the slouches. And you learned quite a few lessons about handling difficult situations, crisis, conflict there. And I think you had a lovely story that you told when we spoke last. Would you just share a bit about some of the things since leaving the military?
So I think, yeah, well, thank you. Since leaving, everyone decides what they want to do. It all depends, I think, on their family circumstances and their own position and where they want to live. And personally, I wanted to have variety. And I want to understand more about the life I haven't lived in the private commercial sector. I want to help charities, and I'm the national president of the Royal British Legion. And I wanted also to have an opportunity to do things I haven't done before. I'd started sailing in the Army and did I did a very good trip up the east coast of America on one of the military yachts. And then I went and signed up for a thing called the Clipper race, which is a round the world race, which Robin Knox Johnson is the CEO. And I did the leg before Christmas from Cape Town into the Southern Ocean round to Fremantle in Australia. And it was. I think I told you we had a few adventures along the way, and it was very hard in many respects. It was cold, it was very wet, big seas, big winds. But I think that's what sort of a lot of military people, that's why I joined the military. I enjoy those adventures and the travels and the excitement. And also testing yourself and then finding out how good you really are and being a stronger person for the experiences of hardship. So yeah, sailing is a big passion of mine.
Yeah, and what was the story about getting things wrong and learning from it?
Well, we had what's called an accidental jibe, which is not it's an awful thing to happen when you're going downwind. The wind gets behind the sail, and the ship, the yacht, accidentally jibes, and we were sort of thrust over onto a different pitch with myself and someone underwater on the wheel, and I think to me it just.
Oh, you actually went underwater.
Well, up to my waist almost.
Oh, sugar!
It was pretty cold and frightening in the middle of the night. But I think if you transpose that into leadership, I always say in all the sort of senior posts, and when I talk to senior people, be humble. Recognize how lucky you are compared to those who may want to be where you are, who never got there.
Yeah.
And be self-reflective, and all of that. In a sort of situation like that, just shows that we can all make mistakes on the helm, and therefore you need to be honest with yourself about your own capabilities, and match yourself carefully to the environment you're operating in.
Yeah.
Prepare properly. Yeah,
very wise. And while we've lost Ben for a while, we're going to carry on going because I'm enjoying this and finding it very useful, and we're recording anyway. So the other thing we were going to talk about was some of the different jobs you're doing now, because you've got quite a portfolio career. You mentioned about charities, but you've been asked to help a number of organizations as a sort of advisor to them. What are some of the things you're doing at the moment?
So, I mean, particularly with the military, I have gone back into some of the military courses, and such as the Higher Command and Staff course and other military headquarters who are training. And they very kindly invited me to come back and help mentor and give something back from what I've learned. And again, this sort of secular idea that nothing ever happens uniquely. There's always others who've had the similar sort of experience. And when you get to command appointments, I said the preparation, you don't really get properly prepared for it. And if you can have someone just to lean on your shoulder and say, look, this happened to me, you might consider this or you might consider that sort of advice, just to try and give people a sort of sense of some of the options they may have in an environment in which they haven't been in before. Yeah. And so I it's called, I do some mentoring in that regard. And then I work for a number of companies on their board, and I, as a sort of senior military advisor, just help them in a number of areas to pass on some of the ways in which I learned and some of the things I did. And they don't automatically cross across easily into a civilian environment, but some of them do, and it's just a broadening of experience, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's good of you to be honest about that the military don't have an arrogance about that. It's the last thing we want anybody to think, that the military think they know it all and they have the answers to everything, because they don't. And sometimes some military people have promised the world to people and got caught on camera, and that's always very embarrassing. You probably can think of a couple of examples. We don't need to mention those officers. But generally, there's some very fine officers who are doing fabulous work, often for charities and other areas, helping with their understanding of crises and problems, and just staying calm under pressure, which takes me on to the next one, dealing with crises. I mean, we're in the middle of the global pandemic of an unprecedented nature, maybe 35% drop in GDP, huge amount of unemployment, people uncertain about the future for a number of years to come, businesses disturbed and the rest, and cash flow problems. What would be your advice about dealing with a crisis, and advice that you've given other people from your own experiences?
I think when you look at the nature of a crisis, and I've sort of lived through a few of these sort of things, and not quite at the same scale as what we're living through now, but they tend to happen. They're unforeseen. We haven't seen them coming. They tend to happen very quickly, and they tend perhaps to almost overwhelm, engulf people. And it's you struggle sometimes to see a way forward and to understand what's going on. So I think the most important thing for anyone in a leadership capacity, or perhaps not even necessarily leadership capacity, is to understand as best they can the context of what's going on. So in this instance, you can see a lot of research going on to understand the biology of this disease we're dealing with, and can we find a cure, and how is it being transmitted, and why young children not getting older people are, and why obese, etc. So you're in a contextual understanding. How did this happen? But it's always too late to a degree. And then the second thing I think you've got to do is act. And if you're static, if you do nothing and you look at it and you worry and you think, well, in a few weeks' time we'll understand more, then I think you get overwhelmed by it. You've got to be decisive as best you can. And those that succeed clearly make the right decisions. You shouldn't act and get it wrong, but having that context will help you. And then I think thirdly, you've got to lead it. You've got to be seen to be out there in front of it, inspiring and helping people. And I think particularly in the military, where often a small crisis involves, sadly, people being killed, people are paralyzed by shock at the awfulness of losing their friends and seeing their friends killed in very awful environments. Again, I think it's important that for military people, they're out and they lead it. And those are the sorts of things I think, and I think some of that works across into other environments beyond just the military. But it's not an easy environment. I mean, no one's comfortable in this sort of, in rapid change. And feeling uncertain and feeling worried, and particularly when you're worried financially and for your family, it's a very difficult and hard environment to live in.
Because this is quite personal for you, because your wife works for the NHS, your son's going to go to Santos and serve in the military, hopefully. I mean, do you want to talk about
my daughter's just qualified as a doctor as well, so
yeah. So tell us a bit about what it means for you personally, this crisis, and how you're handling it.
Well, I think military people are quite well sort of trained to deal with lockdown, actually. You're used to having a bit of a routine of being told what you can and can't do. And I find this environment, reasonably straightforward. I think you've got to be self-disciplined. You clearly, if you're not working, you still need to get up at a certain time, do some phys, have a project to do some reading. So I haven't found it too stressful. I think the only thing we really miss is getting out to see people. So it's an opportunity perhaps to catch up. I mean, clearly, I am anxious about Sarah Lucy going into the hospital every day, and also, as I said, my daughter's also just qualified. So there is a bit of personal sort of worry I have, but I think she had the same for me when I used to go overseas on operations. So I think we're sort of used to it as a family a bit.
Yeah, no, you certainly are. And you've been in many crises, some in the history books and some people won't have heard of, but were certainly very challenging. But at 9/11, you were in one of the headquarters when it all happened, and you have a story about an inspiring leader who...
Yeah, we were talking earlier.
I'd like to hear about that.
Well, you know the man, and the reason we were talking about it is Tony Pigott, very sadly, has very recently died. He was our commandant when we were both at Santos, as you will well know. But on 9/11, 9/11 was rather like this crisis in some regards. I mean, it happened very quickly. It was not foreseen. Well, certainly wasn't foreseen, but by the vast majority of people, and it had huge consequences around the world. And so initially, I think when we reflect back, and I was working in the Ministry of Defence, and I was in the underground command bunker at the time when it happened. For the first, I think, 36, 48 hours, there was just huge uncertainty. What did it mean? America had been attacked. Was someone else going to get attacked? And there were all sorts of questions. And there was a lack of focus to the work we were doing in the buildings. We tried to grapple with the enormity of what had happened and what we could do to help the Americans. And Tony Pigott, who was he was the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff for Commitments, a 3-star general, was overseas at the time, I think on a visit to Africa, and he was rushed back by a military aircraft so he could get back to London. And I always remember he came back into this room we had in the downstairs in the main building in a bunker, and when you're in there, you could have what you're saying televised into various rooms. And he had all the staff, everyone was focused on him. And it was his moment, and he was brilliant. He clarified the situation by asking us 7 questions. And those 7 questions essentially started with who did it and what that did was provide an absolute glue to all this staff work that was going on. It threaded everything together, it gave a focus, and from then on, the staff had a purpose, they knew what they were going to go and do. We didn't know what it would mean in the long term, but here were the things we were now going to start to put in place to start to get towards some sort of normality beyond this crisis. And I thought in that moment, in that sort of 2-hour briefing he gave to all the staff and took questions, he absolutely provided, proper leadership in a crisis that everyone could turn to and look to just to have that certainty, right? We know what we're doing, we've got a direction to go in.
Yeah, so key.
Yeah.
And really taking it from the inspiring leader to the inspiring leadership team, because a leader is crucial for that clarity, that focus, that sense of purpose and meaning behind what they're doing, and the end state of the legacy of what you want to leave things better than you found them. and they then rely on an inspiring team. And you've worked in many different inspiring teams and some bad teams, I imagine, but let's just stay with the inspiring teams. Which, if you were to pick one or two inspiring teams, which would you pick, and what were the qualities that made them inspiring?
I think just generally in the military, because you work in small teams in adversity against a difficult situation, you tend to draw us very close together as a group of individuals. And you'll often find military people who've been together on done things around the world still talking about it many years later, because it was for them a transformational moment, a unique moment in their lives. And when it's good, it is extremely uplifting and powerful, and it carries you on a wave. And I think when I was commanding the Joint Force Headquarters, which was a small team of probably no more than 50 staff, we all knew each other well. We'd done some interesting work around the world together. And when we dealt with the crisis, which was a crisis in Libya, we just had that sort of understanding of each other. We knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. I knew who I could trust and rely on. I understood who they all were. And we were a sort of family. I knew some of their family as well. You know, it was a very strong bond that had been built up through the work we've done. And I think another time in my life...
Can I just pick up on that one? Because you're also very close with Jonathan Shaw, who you saw his video recently, and you described him when we were chatting earlier as an inspiring leader to you, and you learned a lot from him as he was your commanding officer and also director of special forces and things. But that he was quoting Rupert Smith, General Rupert Smith, who talked about, you know, leadership is about pitting your strength against their weakness, and also knowing the strength of your team and knowing their weaknesses. So making use of the strengths, but protecting their weaknesses. And that really fits with what you've just talked about there, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I was going to sort of say as my second example was working in 2 Para at the time under his command, where I was a company commander. And I learned so much from Jonathan. I mean, he was a fantastic leader. And he in turn had learned a lot from Rupert Smith. And intellectually, I think that sort of rolled down into my thinking, such that, you know, I only focused on intent. The clarity that you have to provide as a leader up front is about the intent and people understanding the big ideas that you've got in your head. And I used to spend a lot of time writing intent, and I learned that from Jonathan. And he was very people focused as well, really people focused. And 2 Para at that time was very close because he had a very good touch with everybody. He gave me a lot of room to you know, could have hung myself, I guess, you know, but he trusted me. He gave me lots of authority to go and do the things I wanted to go and do. You know, we won the boxing when he was the CO, the first time we won it ever, I think. And around that created a gel of a battalion spirit. It was a very, very strong and a very happy place for all of us to live and work, and with our families.
Yeah. And then before I hand over to Ben for some quick fire questions, what about a couple of amusing stories? Because, you know, we can get quite serious in a crisis. And one of the things that you've always been good at, even when we were kicking around getting covered in mud and shit on Long Valley, was you always would crack a joke and make us smile.
Well,
you, me and Dave Hudson. So what are your amusing stories?
I was thinking at the time, again, when Jonathan was the CO, and we had a fantastic fancy dress battalion party, which, you know, it's a big risk catch in some regards because you never know what's going to happen. So it was across in a playing field, across a bridge. There was a big swimming pool that someone had sort of built, you know. So we all got thrown, all the officers got thrown in, and all this. And it was just a great party. Anyway, towards the end of the evening, I think some of the soldiers had misbehaved going across the bridge, and the police had then decided to come and just investigate. And across the far side of this field, I could see these 2 policemen coming towards us. I think it was a male officer and a female officer. And then as they got within about 100 meters, the Toms saw them and just ran towards them. And they were going to grab them and throw them in the swimming pool. I think they may have thought there were people in fancy dress. I don't know.
A stripper or something, you know.
Just in time, the battalion 2IC got there and just managed to sort of save the day and our reputation, because it could have been very embarrassing.
Yeah. And then
the other story, which I told last of all, you know, is a time in Iraq when I was the brigade commander, and I was going outside for a cigarette out of the building, and I was walking down the corridor, and you sort of go down the corridor, turn right, I think, and turn left, and you're out the door. And I was stopped by a visits officer, Abby, and she said, and she wanted to talk to me, and then we had a conversation. She said, "Smoking is very bad for you, Brigadier." And I said, "Yes, I know that. But don't tell my wife, I'm, you know, blah. And then there was this huge explosion, and just outside the door, it probably a bit further than just outside, it felt it was at, and the door blew open, there's a rattle, and sort of dust came up the corridor. And she just, we had a sort of laugh. Well, you know, I could easily have been killed if I'd gone out the door. And then don't worry about smoking. You know, smoking really does kill you if you've gone out for a cigarette, because that's where you're standing.
Oh, marvelous! I love it. Great. Well, thank you for that. And over to you, Ben. What's the next stage?
Hey everybody. Yeah, thanks, James. That's some really interesting stories there, and some amazing stuff that you're being involved with. So anybody that's watching, it'd be great if you like, share, comment, ask any questions that you have. It would be fantastic if we can get some interaction there. So while we're waiting for any questions to come up, I've got just a few questions prepared for you, James. And what we've been doing is we're trying to get some wisdom from the people we're interviewing. So people who've experienced crisis, people who have to deal with tough times, and keep a cool head and lead. So we've got a little section which is titled Healthy, Wealthy and Wise. So
okay.
First question is about staying healthy. So obviously you've been in high pressure environments where you've got to keep your head. How do you stay both mentally and physically healthy?
Well, personally, I've always found that in order to stay at least on top of your game, or just, you know, at the very top of the sort of just ticking over, I need my sleep. And I've always prioritized sleep as an absolute weapon for trying to keep yourself in the game. And you know, that's an expression, you know, sleep is a weapon. And commanders who are too tired to think are dangerous. And it's so important to get your sleep. And so I always have, you know, been happy then to say, right, I am going to go to bed. You take over, I'll come back in the morning, and delegate to people to allow them to sleep. To allow them to get on with it while you have some sleep. And I think that's a very important lesson for all people in positions of responsibility. And you can see some of our politicians sometimes look incredibly tired, and they must be working so hard. And it's just so important that people who have huge responsibility stay as fresh as they can. And I said, for me, it's sleep. And I can think the times when I've been in a crisis, my head has hit the pillow, and I don't even remember sort of thinking that I'm about to go to sleep. I was just asleep until my alarm clock went off, and you know, a very deep sleep. And you do so wake feeling refreshed.
Yeah, so important. And you make better decisions, and you can actually cope better.
It was interesting because I was talking about the Apollo 13 series, the 13 Minutes to the Moon, which I think is the best podcast I've heard on dealing with a crisis. And I was listening to it again the other day, to the next episode, and one of the things they were having to deal with is to try and get the 3 astronauts who were stuck on Apollo 13 to get some sleep. And they were so tired, and they had to make some huge decisions and judgments. But sleep was really working against them, and they could monitor it from Mission Command that they hadn't slept, and therefore they realised that the weight of their decision making in space was falling down. And you know, to me, it just highlighted again the importance of people resting.
Yeah. So, and it's sometimes so difficult to carve that time out, though, when you're in under pressure.
It is, but I think you've therefore, I said, you've got to delegate. You've got to trust the people you work with. You've got to train people, your second in commands, or the people to stand up. You've got to do part of the preparation, certainly in the military, is that you train those beneath you to be able to take over from you. And it's an obvious weakness. There's only one of you, and there's 300 people. You are a very weak link in that chain if you go down. So someone's got to be ready to take over from. So you therefore need to create an environment in which you trust people, delegate to them, and empower them in training, so that when something happens, they can step up to the plate to replace you without feeling overly anxious or you know, not able to do the job.
So it sounds like the real key here is having really good people working for you and with you, so you can actually, with a relaxed mind, be held to take that step back.
I think also, I mean, I've never really been in a position where I could choose the people who came to work with me. It was very much they were all appointed to appointments in the headquarters, and I think there's also a huge responsibility on the leader to train his or her staff, and to create the quality of the people around him or her that they want. And I think people really respond to that, to have the clarity about knowing what decision they can make and what decision is left to the leader. And those sorts of training ideas, I think, are fundamental to building a team.
Staying with that one, Ben, if I could just come in.
Sure.
Many of the CEOs that I work with get a team that they inherit when they become CEO, and they go, I don't like those people, and they clear them out. A bit like when I worked for Field Marshal Inge, he thought it was a good idea to fire 2 of his brigadiers or whatever to encourage the rest. And normally it happened within about a week that he'd fire various people. I'm not quite sure how wise that was. I don't think it was very fair. I don't think he gave them a chance, but he decided to fire them just to scare everybody else. It was a sort of culture of fear rather than inspiring leadership. But in business, people think they can change the team over and have a completely new team. But in the military, you made it clear there, they get appointed by somebody else in the military secretary's branch where you were, and these are the roles they get. So you get a team that you don't choose. But I see good military leaders make the most of what they have and train and develop them. But a lot of CEOs complain they've been given poor people. They're not their people, and they'll bring in their people from their last job or their last firm, clean out all who are there and have their people, particularly if they're in private equity, fire the CEO, fire the CFO, put in a new team and incentivize them with massive bonuses if they hit the numbers, whatever happens to the people. What's your thoughts, James?
Well, I think the American military are big enough that they tend to, at senior level, pull people with them that they know and like, and they drag people in that they want. The British military is too small to do that. I think there is advantages and disadvantages to both of those options. I think clearly, if you've got people you know can do the job and do it well, why wouldn't you want them on your team? And they know you, and they trust you, and you trust them. And you've done lots of jobs with them beforehand. I can see the advantage of that. I think the disadvantage of doing that is that you tend to get too many people around you who think like you do. And you're all the same mindset. And to my mind, I think that's where Stan McChrystal fell down, very unfortunately, what happened to him in Afghanistan. But this article happened in the newspaper, and the reporter was with them, and around him he had all his best friends and people he trusted and really believed, and they all were very, very close. But they all perhaps just thought on the same bearing all the time, and looked at the same problem the same way, or looked at the problem the same way. And there wasn't a critical friend amongst them who could say, hang on a sec, is this a wise thing to do? And I think that's the balance. If you get, I love working with people I like and trust. It's great to have it, but I just worry sometimes that too much of that, and you haven't got enough questioning people around you.
And diversity of thought to bring
Absolutely.
new ideas and creativity into the mix.
Because there's always lots of ways of solving a problem.
It
just happens that you have done a certain way before that worked. It doesn't mean it will work every time.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so second question is on wealth. I think that everyone could do with some good advice around money. So what's the best piece of advice you've ever received or that you give about money?
Well, I think probably that I was told when I joined the military I'd never make any money, which is fine. And I thought that's not why I wanted to join the army. And I think the wealth of my life is about the experiences and the things I've done and the travels and the people I've worked with, particularly in adversity, and the strength of the friendships I've created through that. In the same way, actually, that I have the same friendships now with people I sail with, because we share adversity together. So I think I just might learn from that. Don't follow the money as a lifestyle. I think a lot of serious people who look at this recognize that it's not the way to happiness.
Absolutely.
Just balance your life.
I think a lot of people will be reassessing their lives in this lockdown period and really sort of having different experiences of being at home with family, with people you care about, and having extended time like myself with my baby who's 9 months old has been the one sort of positive out of this lockdown. So I think a lot of people will be looking about how their balance of work life and what they want to achieve out of
and they'll
the
probably
future.
be and they'll be stronger and better for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think businesses are gonna reassess how they what they expect of people in that way.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see what changes now.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that regard, yeah.
So final question on these three is about wisdom. So a piece of wisdom that you sort of live your life by, a credo which you try and strive for.
Well, I mentioned it just now, but the life I try to live is, and encourage others to live, is one of balance, to hold things in perspective, in balance. And I say the people that I love and know the best and admire the best are those who seem to have their life in balance, and they are very competent, capable people. They may be very good soldiers or very good bankers, but they're also good fathers or mothers, good husbands and wives. They are scratch golfers, well, probably not quite, but anyway, they've got a leisure activity they enjoy and pursue, and they just hold all those things in a balance. And I think that's a great way to try and aspire to live your life. And I don't always achieve everything I want to do in that regard, but I think I try and hold that as a focus. And I've particularly in the military, I have worried over the years that a lot of military people are so singular focused on what they do, and it's a very good thing in many ways. And I wouldn't decry it, but it does suck you in a way perhaps that very few things do in life. And I can't be certain of that because I haven't lived lots of other life, but the military is a very one-dimensional type of lifestyle, particularly when you go on operations. And it's quite selfish in that regard. You take yourself away from your family and you go overseas for many months. You leave them behind, perhaps to worry and be concerned about you, and you get on with the job you've got to do. And the mission comes first is the great cry that carries us all together. And that's fundamentally important. But there is a risk that you lose, I say, a sense of balance in your life, that you are wholly focused on your career and your soldiers to the detriment perhaps of your children or your partner.
Sure. Yeah, and just a question that I've sort of wondered, and one that I haven't asked you, Jonathan. It probably applies to both of you. What made you take the step of a military career? What made you take that jump? Because I know it's something that a lot of people consider when they're younger. I know I did, but never took the.
Well, I think I'll speak for myself. I think I wanted to do something different for 3 years after university. I didn't want to pursue a normal lifestyle. I wanted to do something that was completely different, and perhaps sort of get it out of my system, and then I'd do a grown-up job, and life would move on. And it didn't quite happen like that. I sort of I just stayed on and
did a very grown-up job.
Well, it just grows on you, and if you enjoy it and you're happy doing it, then I think it's the right thing to do. I couldn't really think of anything else, as it went on, that I would enjoy more. And for me, it just ticked all the boxes about the physical challenge, travel, excitement, working with people, doing something that was deemed important by the nation. It's a wonderful life in that regard. And I suppose I never got it out of my system. It's probably why particularly I love the physicality of the parachute regiment. Once I could get used to some of the hard, you feel you achieve something after a hard exercise or a hard march with weight or something. It's a great experience. That's probably why I still enjoy sailing. It's that I like to have a challenge, a physical challenge to overcome.
Yeah, definitely. And before we came on the call, you were sort of talking about the work you're doing advising at the moment.
Yeah.
And your sort of career must have really almost prepared you for advising people in a crisis.
I think only because I've lived through a certain number of, like 9/11 or the Libya crisis, or particular short-term crises in Iraq and Afghanistan, when things have gone wrong unexpectedly, and you're again, this overwhelming sense comes to you, and you have to step into the breach. And I think those sorts of experiences as a leader do prepare you they give you some context to hold your hat against when it comes to looking at something like this. When I'm outside the military and I'm looking in at how this crisis is going to impact on companies, or it's having a big impact, for example, on the Royal British Legion. And so we had a trustee meeting on Monday, and we have to make some quite difficult decisions about the best way to manage our way through the crisis.
Yeah, there must be so many charities which are just massively struggling right now.
Yeah, I mean, the Legion is strong. The Legion's fine, but nonetheless, there are some difficult decisions that the trustees need to make about fundraising and remembrance. That so it's interesting to see these sort of decisions being made, and you're slightly outside it, and you're just sitting on the periphery trying to help where you can. Yeah.
So we got not a question, but a comment and best wishes from someone. So Miles Webb. So he's just made a comment saying, whilst I'd never wish a crisis on anyone, you can't help feeling that a crisis really tests your team and gives you a rare insight into the real competency of people you thought perhaps more capable. Equally hidden, stars reveal themselves. So we get that opportunity in the military often on ops, but not always in civilian life. He says, "Hope you're well, General. All the best."
I think Miles, thanks for that. You're absolutely spot on. This is a lot of what you prepare for in the military is to do something, is to deal with a crisis. And when you know it's just an exercise, you know when it's going to finish, you know there'll be an outcome. When it's a crisis and there is no real clarity of how it's going to end, or how long it's going to go on for, or what it's going to really mean, I think some people have, I've seen them just fall apart slightly with worry and uncertainty because they're so used to living in that certain bubble. And it is interesting how some people have just got that sort of strength of character that you don't see until you put them under a lot of pressure, who are just, who your go-to people when things start to go badly wrong.
Yeah.
And actually, normally it's not your stars. It's your stars to a degree. Sometimes can, that they worry too much because they've been, always going. And it's the stoical, steady people who are your go-to people in a crisis because they're just reliable and they're not flustered, and they just cope and manage. And I agree. That's a great thought, because it's a great insight, I think, by Miles, because I said, a crisis brings out the best and the worst in people.
Yeah. Well, actually, can I just come in there, James? Because talking with, I served with the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards, and I took over as a platoon commander just after the Falklands War. They'd been to war, and they talked about people who they were surprised they thought weren't very good, were actually very courageous in the conflict, and people who they thought were really good, who were actually quite scared and inadequate when the moment came. They didn't serve as well, though they'd like to talk themselves up afterwards and tell a good story about how they really did it. But the soldiers knew who were the courageous ones and who were actually disappointing. What have you found? How would you know, if you're a CEO of a business, who's going to be good in a crisis and who's not? Have you any sort of benchmarks or litmus tests, or from experience that you've learned when you can tell the bluffers and the ones who actually will come through? I mean, any views?
No, I don't think you can. I think that the crisis is needed in order to bring out these, the strengths of those who can manage best in a crisis. I think you can replicate some of this in training and in exercises and scenarios, and you can push people a certain degree to see who can handle it. But I think to try and have an insight into what someone's going to do in a crisis is quite difficult. And it's quite, as I say, and that's why people often say it's unusual who you expected to perform struggled and who you were not expecting to be a gallant or a courageous or a strong NCO to come through. As interesting, and Jonathan Shaw talked about this, and the Falklands War, so come back to this idea of an exercise. You're used to an end date, and now you don't know. And sometimes it's, in fact, Hugh Pike actually talked to me about this, actually, or John both of them. But the officers tend to think too much. They're trying to fathom out, rationalise, make sense of it all, and they sort of burn themselves up worrying and thinking. And the stoical young soldier who's just got to carry the weight, do this, do that, are the ones who just say, well, we'll live it day by day, and and we'll see what happens. And if we get through it, we get through it. And having that sort of mental approach to this, I think, has got its benefits.
Yeah, and you alluded to earlier your wife and your daughter both working for the NHS in the front line, and my brother does the same, and his two children are both doctors, one in intensive care doctoring. They are going to have their turn of PTSD probably from some of the trauma they've seen, the deaths that they will deal with in some of the intensive care work. You've seen this happen to good men and women who've served in the military, and maybe 10 years later. Indeed, Dave Hudson had the courage to talk about his grandfather who was in Burma as a doctor, but suffered from PTSD. And he talked about his own PTSD after he'd had a number of tours of special forces, but it happened years later. How are we going to help people like that in the NHS who are going to suffer the trauma of what they're seeing and experiencing in the coming years?
I don't know. I think it could be a significant issue for the NHS. But I think, one thing I would say is that the NHS, those who work in intensive care, those who work in A&E, those who are close to this, are quite used, as best one can ever be, to seeing injuries and death and dealing with death. And a lot of people come into hospital die in hospital, and so they're used to that process of and they've got obviously a mortuary and all that. It's just I think you as best you can be, you get quite sort of, I wouldn't say immune, but you get quite strengthened and you have a lot of toughness about it. And I saw it my own wife, Sarah Lisa, when she was a young student working in A&E, she changed. I always talk about this. She changed after she'd worked in A&E, and she then witnessed and seen the horrors of difficult injuries leading to death, and is used to it. And I think for the NHS it will be the same. I don't think necessarily the NHS will have the same struggles, perhaps, because I think I think for the military, I think there are two things really. First of all, there is the violence of the death you witness, and secondly, they are people you know. And if you're a doctor and someone comes in, you've never met them before, and I think those two factors are additional to some of the stress that military people go through, and then they don't go through it the rest of their lives. They then go back to try and live a normal life. And I think the interesting thing about PTSD, or one of the interesting things, is that it's a delay before it occurs, and sometimes, as I say, it's many years afterwards that people fully recognise what's going on inside them, their minds, that is causing them to feel so, I don't know, angry, upset, whatever feature of behaviour that may be unusual for them.
Yeah, thank you for going to quite a difficult area. What about your learning in challenging times when you've got it wrong, made a mistake, and what you learned from your mistakes? Because we're all human. I think it's described as we are the incomplete leaders leading the complete teams. As an incomplete leader, work in progress, what do you reckon you got badly wrong, and how did that shape you as a leader that you are today, having had the humility to learn from getting it wrong? Because I got so many things wrong, I could write a book about my mistakes.
I think we just need to be honest with ourselves that we all make mistakes. We do get things wrong, and I think one of the ways in which I've learned is that I've made things have gone wrong for me when I've been at my most confident or assured, and it's a sense that nothing else, we've really got this, and then suddenly from out of left field something happens, and I've always sort of taken that as sort of that now's the moment when things are going really well, start really thinking about what could go wrong. And you feel very sure of yourself, and you perhaps become a little bit lazy. You start thinking through all the what ifs and the contingencies, and you are more comfortable in the moment because you've got to where you want to be. And I think you've got to always have, I always use that thing, what now, what next, what if. It's a planning, it's the thing we use on, when you're what's happening now, what is planned to happen next, and you're thinking through that and getting ready for it. And then what if something happens that we hadn't foreseen? Have you got a reserve? Have you got a contingency stood by? And having people challenge that what if, and saying, well, what if there was an international pandemic? It'll never happen. And of course, you then start to do your risk judgments about how much you're going to perhaps spend on contingency spares and PPE and all that, or in the military, how much you're going to take away from what you're doing and create a reserve just in case something else is going to happen that you can't foresee, but you don't know what.
Do you think that this is, after experiencing this sort of crisis, that governments and businesses are going to start preparing long term for these sort of things?
Well, as a lesson identified. Well, I think there is. I mean, there is a national risk. The Cabinet Office holds a list of national risks that are assessed as best they can, and then against that, there are then government departments and resources assigned to cover off against that risk, and whether it be terrorist attack in our own country, or the failure of the economy, or the fuel tankers going on strike, or whatever it may be, you have thought through things that could go wrong, and you might well call them risks. And then against that, you're then going to make judgments about which ones you're going to prepare for, and which ones perhaps too expensive, or may never happen to worry about. And I can recall when I was in my last job, we had some awful floods up in Cumbria in 2015, the winter of 2015, and the defences had been built, such as they were, a huge investment in money, to cover 90% of the likely tidal weather systems, and the 10% hit them. And so that the defences were overwhelmed. There was very significant flooding, and I, in the aftermath of that, they talked about, well, we can't afford as a nation to prepare against this, very minuscule chance, or it may have been even less than 10%, for the cost to build these defences, these seawalls, and all the rest of it, that there is required. I think I noticed the government have committed a lot of money now following the floods this March, which has largely been forgotten very quickly now, to try and prevent it happening again. But it does require a huge amount of money to be spent to cover you off against the worst case scenario, which happens once or twice a year, or perhaps once or twice a generation.
And that is a very interesting point that you make, James, about the allocation of resources as a leader, CEO, general, prime minister, minister of a department. Where do you put your reserve? Where do you put your resources? Do you have, as a military, just in case, or do you do just in time kind of logistics, which of course many companies, and I know, happened for many of my colleagues and myself, that we had just enough to get by, but no big savings and no big reserves. So when the cash flow stops, many small companies are struggling. And that's the hard one, where you actually either have good fortune, you can say it was a good decision. You might have, who's preparing for an asteroid strike, which will take out electricity stations and things like that, or EMP surge or something, which, there's so many things. Any view on how you decide to allocate your resources and prepare for things that may never happen or may happen once a century? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think most people now use a risk register of some description, which has on the X and Y axis the likelihood and then the consequence, and you probably put most of your eggs, if it's a basket environment, in the middle of it. You probably don't invest in the things that are least likely to happen, and certainly least likely with least damage to you. So if it's a this is the flood situation. It's really consequences enormous. Likelihood is very little. How much are you prepared to put resource against that? And I think it comes down to priorities and how much we can afford as a nation in this environment to spend on this sort of.
I think businesses don't do it in the same way, and they're under pressure as leaders to create value for shareholders, or create profit and revenues. So preparing for crisis is a massive cost. I think that most businesses report out, small, medium, and large. I read a recent a book which surveyed the CEOs of Fortune 500 and asked them what crisis plans had they got in place, and less than 50% had any crisis plans. And the second question was, how do you think you would perform in a crisis? and over 93% said that they do really well.
So they smash it, yeah.
Yeah, so I think most businesses went straight through the planning stage of crisis management, straight into recognizing you're in a crisis and recognizing what sort of crisis you're
having to deal with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think just-in-time logistics, as you say, is an efficiency measure. It allows you to save on your overheads because you don't have huge warehouses with stores held in them. You just have the stores when you need them, and all the efficiency that creates. And as you say, if it's a in a capitalist environment where the shareholders the wealth matters, then you're going to reduce your overhead costs as much as you can, which all makes sense. But if you live in a very, very finely geared environment economy where everything has to arrive on time to allow you to deliver that, it only takes a small cog not to mesh properly for the process to fall over. And when you have something like a pandemic like this, where you've now got a huge amount of air freight not arriving, it takes a while to re-engineer those meshes to perhaps deal with having sea containers, which obviously are going to take longer, and you're going to have to put some storage in place now, etc., to recalibrate how you're going to run your logistics and your support. And I think a lot of that is now going on.
Yeah.
But even further than that, looking at cash flows, where these huge companies who were looking at needing government support had huge amounts of cash on hand, which they invest into share buyback schemes, which could have got them through this
absolutely.
crisis.
And I think and I think therefore the answer to a degree is to come back to my what ifs, and you call it red teaming, you can call it whatever you want, but someone is going to say, what if this happens? And I think even if you've done a little bit of intellectual thinking about a potential problem, you are at least one step ahead when it happens.
Yeah, brilliant.
It's keeping it on for longevity though, because I saw a recent interview with Arnold Schwarzenegger of all people, and he said when he was governor of California, he stockpiled PPE for such an eventuality as a pandemic or a bio attack or some sort of crisis. But the expense of storing it all came to the crunch when at some point the next governor or had to make a decision between the 2-3 million it was costing to store this PPE and keeping it on. But so that sort of memory sort of fades over time, doesn't it? That
corporate
people
memory
aren't prepared anymore.
No, they're certainly not. Ben, I think we last couple of minutes. Have you got any questions
absolutely.
from anybody
So
out
we've just
there?
got a couple of comments. So we got somebody who listened in last time, Venkat, who is just beginning his career. I think he asked the question last time as well, and he's just going back to your comment around not following the money.
Yeah.
So for him, he says there's a question that always comes to me, being from a middle-class family dangling between poverty lines. Money is very enticing. It does make me work for something that really pays well, but in turn damages my career growth. What are your thoughts on that? And how do you suggest anyone can balance life between money and their life itself? Interesting.
Well, this is the question. This is a very good friend of mine, Sam McGrath, has written a book about, it's called Parafit, and in it he talks about health, and he talks about the balance between those who chase wealth and those who look after their health. And what you tend to happen is those that chase wealth for a period of time and sacrifice their health will then spend all the money that they can find in the world to try and keep themselves healthy when their bodies start to go wrong at 60 because they haven't looked after themselves or something like that. And I think that's one of the things that will come out of this pandemic is that I read in the paper that over 300,000 people have stopped smoking. I think it has made people more aware of the importance of your health. And so I say to Ben, that the money is very alluring, but when you actually boil it down and look at what more money can mean to you, it's probably, unless you win the lottery, it's not going to change your life. It's going to mean you can have a bigger car or a bigger house, or go on more expensive holidays. It doesn't mean you haven't got a car and you haven't got a house and you go on holidays. It's just upgrade. And is it worth the consequence for trying to chase those extra bucks for the bigger house and the bigger car, the sacrifice you may make elsewhere? And I think that's what people should think about. And of course, if you're, as he's described himself as middle class, he's got an aspiration probably around money and position in life. But I think all the evidence that I've ever read and seen suggests, and witnessed people I've met, is that it is the balance and it is the happiness you get from a fulfilled life, not just on a one-dimensional pursuit of either money or whatever. Yeah,
$1,000,000%. Yeah,
and just Ben coming in there. I mean, building on what you're saying, James. Time and again in the coaching of people I'm with. Particularly, I was working with a friend of mine in Ireland, Oliver Johnson, who's going to be on the series at some stage. And he's writing about stepping back from the top team, about when people do retire and they look back over their lives, the choices they made, what they went for. That time and again, it's about living your life on purpose rather than off purpose. So what is it that will give his life meaning and purpose? Because mental health, if people have meaning and purpose and they have a passion about what they do, and they exercise and keep fit, they're generally going to be in a very good, mentally healthy position. But if they're doing something which is just chasing the money, but it has no passion for them and it doesn't give their life meaning and purpose, that's a big problem. They should not do that. Don't live your life off purpose. Live it on purpose would be my tip.
Yeah, I can definitely say it's a much happier life if you get up every morning wanting to go and do what you do rather than grinding out the days, because you spend a hell of a lot of time at work. So it might as well be something which is purposeful, as you say.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And actually, well, one of the companies I work for Jitsu, Tim Gibson, who's the president who I work with, he said to me, Bash, when you come and work, you'll enjoy it. You'll want to get out of bed to come down and work with me. And he's been absolutely spot on. It's interesting work, and it inspires you, and you want to go and go to work to do it.
Yeah, that's great. So, what's you going to end with then, Ben? What's the finale?
So it'd be great to just get a book recommendation to finish off with. It's always nice to know either something that's been really interesting or something that's been sort of formative for you.
So I've just read it, and this is new to me, but it's called East West Street by Philipp Sands, who's a lawyer by trade, and he writes about the Holocaust, and he traces his family who were persecuted by the Nazis, and then from a legal perspective, he looks and examines how the case was brought at Nuremberg to try people for crimes against humanity. And even actually to talk about potentially go as far as genocide. And this was the first time that state could be taken to an international court for crimes against their own people. And it's a very interesting read in terms of looking at his history and the family, because he came from in the Ukraine originally, and how his family was so lucky to survive everything that went on around Nazi-occupied Europe. And then how that these crimes have now, and I think my time in the military, we were involved in the Balkans. We had the same challenge against people now being taken to court, crimes against humanity in their own country in the Balkans. And it's very sad, and it's very powerful in many ways. And the Holocaust remains, I think, one of the most and the persecution of the Jews by Nazis remains one of the greatest, most awful things about crimes, man's inhumanity to man, the Robin Burns line, of the 20th century. Yeah. So it sparks a lot of thoughts and self-reflection. I think anyone who reads it. But I'd recommend it. East West Street, Philipp Sands.
Well, thank you, General. Fantastic. And it also reminds me of The Bloodlands, which is another book about, not only was it the Nazis, but actually Stalin. Between them, they killed about 20 million civilians. In that area of Ukraine and all the rest. And that's a powerful book to read. But look, thank you. This has been a fascinating session. And Ben and I are delighted that we did a re-record because of the technology problems we had last time.
Thanks so much for coming back.
We had a completely different conversation with you, touched on some similar things, but also much greater depth, a far richer conversation. And General James Bashall, CBE. It's a real honour to have had you on the show, so thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Ben. It's an equal honour to be invited to come onto this show. You have so many more worthy people than myself to be interviewed, but it's a great privilege, and thank you. And thank you for what you're doing. I do think it's a great series that you've pulled together here, both of you. It's really good. Well done.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Yeah.